Hello, everybody, and welcome to this sixth session of the RENEW18 Open Research Seminar. I'm Marco Storni. I'm a postdoc in the RENEW18 group. And our guest for today's seminar is Patrick Connolly. Patrick is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, and he's been working there since 2023. His work has mostly focused on the history of philosophy and history of philosophy of science, especially in the 17th and 18th century, and on British philosophy. He's been mostly working on the relationship and interactions between philosophy, theology, and the natural sciences in this period. And his work has mostly focused on figures like Locke, Newton, and other authors relating to them. Among the many publications and publication projects I'd like to mention, there is one in particular, which is a book manuscript on Newton's Metaphysics of Substances, which will be hopefully be out soon, and we'll very much look forward to reading that. Today, as usual, Patrick will have the opportunity to present a work in progress, which we will then discuss together. And the draft paper is presenting is entitled Locke, Substances and Demonstration in Natural Philosophy. So please, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Marco. I really appreciate it. And I'll just start by saying thanks so much to all of you for being here and joining me today. I was just saying earlier, I was so excited when I first learned about RENEW18. I love the scope, the idea, the sort of ambition and promise of the program. So I've been sort of trying to follow along as the project gets underway from a distance. So I'm really especially excited to join you virtually today. So it's a big honor. I'll just say I know that pre-read sessions involve quite a lot more by way of time and commitment from the audience. So I wanted to say thanks in advance for, I know your time is valuable. So I appreciate everybody taking the time to look at the paper. So Marco suggested I speak for 10, 15 minutes, try and set up the paper a little bit, say something about kind of where it came from, what I take it to be doing or hope that it does, and maybe something about kind of where I'm at with the paper just now. So I'm obviously very interested in Newton. I can't claim any mathematical or physical competence or expertise. But nonetheless, I'm really fascinated by Newton's kind of intellectual biography, and I'm really fascinated by Newton's metaphysical projects. And I've been working on this book manuscript. I'm in the very, very final stages of finishing it, so hopefully that'll be coming out soon. But maybe like a lot of you, I think Newton is great, but I'm as interested in the reception of Newton. I think the reception of Newton is as interesting, almost as interesting, maybe more interesting than Newton himself. And I think the negative reception of Newton, or the critical reception of Newton, is fascinating. We can learn a lot from that. But for myself, I've mostly been interested in the positive reception of Newton. So I tried to think a bit, or I published a little bit about people like Richard Bentley and George Shane and Colin Maclaren and Susanna Newcomb. And I guess it seems to me in his public-facing moments that Newton is very quiet about a lot of questions that are really interesting and important. Newton doesn't give us a whole lot. And what interests me is the way in which a lot of his followers or proponents try to fill out the logical space made available by Newton, try to answer some of the questions that he himself leaves quiet. So obviously I've been doing that in the British context and in the Anglophone context. So I'm really excited by RENEW18 and the way that people, in your project are doing that in France, in the Low Countries and German-speaking lands. I think that's all to the good. So that's one place this project comes from, just trying to think about Newton, trying to think about how early people were reading Newton, trying to make sense of Newton, understand Newton, kind of fill out the space. But also I'm independently very interested in Locke. That's what my PhD studies were on. I'm really interested in Locke's relationship to natural philosophy generally. And I think it's fair to say that in Locke studies, there's a consensus that, Locke is a big proponent of Newton. He's a big fan of Newton. Newton is one of his quote unquote master builders. And I think there's a consensus that there's some kind of problem in virtue of that. There's various ways of motivating the problem, characterizing the problem, thinking about the problem. I talk a little bit about that at the outset of this paper. But the basic worry, I think, is that there's some kind of mismatch between Locke's epistemic commitments and the kind of or the type of natural philosophy that Newton himself is doing, the kind of project that Newton's doing in the Principia. And so I can, as personal biography, I think when I was in graduate school and kind of coming out of graduate school, I really agreed with that. I thought there was a problem here. And it seemed to me that the best strategy was ameliorization, so trying to make the problem seem less bad, or trying to make things look a little bit better for Locke. And I guess I was really tempted by this strategy that people like Peter Anstey had employed of finding diachronic change. So trying to suggest that Locke changed his views or underwent some kind of development or change of heart, or learned something. So the view was, Locke had one set of commitments and one kind of vision for natural philosophy. But then the Principia was published and all was light and the scales fell from Locke's eyes, and he undergoes some kind of personal conversion. And so then what Locke has to do is try to revise or readjust or recalibrate, kind of retrofit Newtonian findings back onto the subject of the essay. Maybe that can only go so far. Maybe Locke doesn't see it through. Maybe it's kind of imperfect, but that's kind of where we are. And, and I guess I really believed that for a while. I thought that was kind of the right attitude to have. That was the right way to think about these things. But for me, a big turning point was, I guess, a long time ago now, several years ago now. I started thinking really seriously about this time Locke spent in France in the 1670s. So from 1675-ish to 1679-ish, Locke's in France, nominally for his health, but who knows, for all kinds of reasons. And I was looking at what Locke was doing while he was in France and who he was meeting with and kind of what was taking up his time and interest. And one of the things that amazed me was how plugged in he was to circles of astronomers and circles of what we now call mathematical physicists. So this is long before the Principia. It's long before Locke and Newton meet one another and become friends. It's also long before Locke writes the text of the essay. But in this time, he's hanging out with people like Cassini and Ole Romer and Jean Picard. He's at the Observatoire de Paris. He's doing observations with people. He's reading Huygens. And so that kind of made me revisit the idea that 1687 is the first time Locke thinks seriously about the prospects for mathematical physics, or the first time he thinks seriously about mechanics or astronomy. It just seemed to me actually much earlier on he was really motivated and invested in more or less the kind of thing Newton's doing in the Principia. So I think I say a little bit about that in the paper you all read at the very end. I wrote a paper in Archiv für Geschichte der Philosophie, which goes through the details of that a little bit. And also at the same time, I was trying to think about Locke and demonstration and the way demonstration works in Locke and kind of what demonstrative knowledge is. And so at the outset of the paper for today, I give what I think is very much a consensus view in Locke studies, that we can have demonstrations in some domains, but we can't have demonstrations in other domains. So we can have demonstrations in mathematics and politics because those deal with, and in ethics, because those deal with Lockean modes and Lockean relations. But we can't have demonstrations in natural philosophy because it deals with substances. And I guess I believe that at the right level of abstraction, that's basically true. That story didn't come from nowhere. That story has a lot going for it. At the same time, I think, as always, the devil is really in the details. And so I was trying to think a little bit harder about Lockean demonstrations. And I was trying to think about them from the standpoint of what you might call epistemic practice, rather than from a detached kind of theoretical epistemological standpoint. So I was interested in what Lockean demonstrations look like on the ground and what Locke says about how you go about constructing a demonstration, what kind of ideas you need. It seems to me Locke actually says a lot about what makes demonstrations go well, what makes demonstrations go poorly. And so I was thinking about that, and I became convinced that the story about morality was wrong. That it's true, Locke thinks, in theory, we can have demonstrative knowledge of morality. But in practice, Locke never pursues that project. He never recommends that project. Nothing he says about ethics invokes demonstration in any kind of meaningful way. And it seemed to me that when you look at what he says about how demonstrations actually work on the ground, it's very clear why that is. So I started wondering if the opposite was true. Locke says that, in theory, there's no demonstration in natural philosophy, but is that true in practice? Is that really how he sort of lives his epistemic life? And it seemed to me not really. It seemed to me maybe there were avenues for demonstration in natural philosophy. And so that's kind of what I try to do in this paper. It's in a way the second half of this paper I wrote about demonstration in morality for Locke. So that's what this paper is designed to do. It's designed to say Locke actually sees some prospects for demonstration in natural philosophy. They're hard, they're carefully constrained, you have to be really careful, this, that, the other, but there is one avenue for him kind of open there. And the story we've been telling ourselves about Locke's epistemology is problematically oversimplified. So that's the basic story about the paper, a little bit about where it came from, what I'm trying to do in it. Like I said, I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I'm excited to get the benefit of your expertise. And so I'm open to any and all questions, comments, feedback. But here are two things I've been thinking about a lot recently, or two things I'm trying to figure out as I move forward with the paper. And so things I'm especially open to hearing your thoughts on. And I guess in a way, they're both about the paper or the project maybe not being unified or trying to do kind of different things in a way. And so I'm curious what you all think. So here's the first thing I'm wrestling with. On the one hand, this paper is about Locke, and it's about Locke's views on demonstration and Locke's theory of knowledge and whether we can have demonstrations that sort of involve substances in one way or another. On the other hand, so what I'm trying to say is like Locke thinks we can have demonstrations about substances, provided we focus on the right ideas in those demonstrations and we quarantine off these kind of harmful ideas. And so I'm trying to lay out some basic facts about Locke's epistemology, the theory of ideas. I'm trying to say, hey, Locke himself recognized this. Locke himself pointed this out. He's kind of self-consciously aware of this. And so I wanted to bring that to light. On the other hand, you might think, well, this isn't a paper about Locke and Locke's epistemology. This is a paper about Newton and Newton's physics and the way Newton's physics works. It's really just about Locke's understanding of Newton. So the key issue is about how and whether Locke understood the Principia and how and whether Locke could make sense of the Principia. So pretty obviously, I think these two things are related, and I tried to sort of marry them in this paper. But I'm worried that maybe the way they get presented in the paper doesn't offer a very clear through line at the end of the day. And so I wonder about whether what I should do is actually really prioritize maybe the stuff on Locke's epistemology and relegate everything about Newton to like a case study, or, like make it a little bit more liminal to what happens in the paper. Or on the flip side, maybe I should just really foreground the issues about Newton and try and soft pedal the stuff about Locke's epistemology a bit more. Or maybe I need to split the paper in two, or maybe it's fine as it is, but I'm just a little bit up in the air about those kinds of issues. And then here's the second thing I'm really wrestling with. So the paper is about Locke, but also the paper is about Newton, obviously. And I think there's something that I was not very clear about in my own mind while writing the paper. And so I guess you could think about like two ends of a big spectrum that the paper could fall on. So on one end of that spectrum, you could say something like, Locke really understood everything Newton was doing in the Principia. He really understood everything about Newton's project and methodology and everything about Newton's findings. And Locke had the resources for making sense of everything that happened in the Principia, which he understood perfectly and which he sort of validates and, is totally on top of. And so Locke and Newton are in like perfect lockstep on everything. So you might have that view. On the other hand, you might have, well, no, this paper is really about Locke. Don't worry about Newton so much. Locke's just making space, or this is just one person's interpretation of Newton. And maybe it misses out on important details. Maybe Locke didn't understand everything Newton was doing. But really, this is just, about Locke's way through this set of issues, which is broadly related to Newton. And I guess I want to fall somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. But as I said, when I was writing, I don't think I was very clear about that. And I'm tempted to say I actually probably need to start putting more distance between the actual historical Newton himself and what I'm saying is Locke's understanding of Newton. But I know a lot of you in the RENEW18 project are navigating different versions of this, so you're thinking about Hartsoker, Skravsand, or Schelling or whatever, and there's a difference between how any of those people, like their Newtonianism and the Newtonianism of Newton. And so I just, maybe some of you have thoughts on the best way to sort of present a figure without, as we're incurring all the baggage of, Newton's methodology and findings and everything. So that's something I'm just a little bit not clear on and don't think I did a great job on, but I'm happy to solicit advice or hear suggestions about. Okay, so I'll stop now, and I'll just say I'm looking forward to talking with all of you. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for this nice introduction. We now open the floor for questions from the audience. Does anybody want to start? Otherwise, I have a first question. So I have several questions, but I will start with one. When I finished your paper, in the conclusion, I think, or in the final pages, you discussed a little bit Locke's review of Newton. And this, so I haven't read this review myself, so I don't know whether it's really interesting as of his content. But since that you said the paper is intended to be on Locke and Newton, when I finished reading the paper, I wondered why this didn't come up earlier in the discussion. Is there a reason linked to the content of the review because it's irrelevant to what you're doing, or something else?
Thanks. That's a great question. One thing I thought about doing was taking that material from the conclusion and moving it to the introduction, using this as a motivating, I ask what I think are genuinely good questions. Why, if Locke didn't know or care about this material, why would he be the reviewer? Why did Locke start reading the Principia so early if he had no antecedent interest in these issues? So I mean, I'm just repeating what I said in the conclusion, but so I thought about, and I think somebody else who'd read the paper suggested maybe switching the order around and doing the speaking about the review earlier. But you also asked about what's going on in the review, and why don't I speak about it in more detail? I'm of the mind that the review is not that interesting, I guess I would say. So Peter Anstey and Larry Principe are putting together a volume of Locke's writings on natural philosophy for the official Academy Clarendon edition of Locke. They have sort of what's supposed to be the definitive critical edition. And so I think more people will see this review soon. They're going to do a translation from French as well, which for people in the States is very helpful. So yeah, I guess what I'd say is this: the review is very breezy. It's short, it's quick, it doesn't engage in hugely substantial ways. And also for my purposes, Locke kind of, so you've all seen, Newton's own introduction to the first edition, which is the only edition of the Principia. So Locke only lived to see the first edition of the Principia. And Newton's own, the author's preface to the Principia is controversial. He says a bunch of what seem to be really confusing things about mechanics and what the project is. And Locke kind of parrots some of those. And it seems to me that it doesn't actually, what Newton says there doesn't map super cleanly onto Locke's epistemology. And so I guess in that sense, I'm a little bit hesitant to build too much out of the review just because it is short, it is breezy. It's also Locke writes this review before he meets Newton. So Locke writes this review while he's living in the Low Countries. In 1688, 89, he goes back to England and he meets Newton at that point. And after meeting Newton, they correspond a bunch. So Newton sends Locke a copy of the Principia with annotations and notes. He sends him this short text called A Demonstration that the Planets May Move in Ellipses by the Power of Gravity, or something like that, which is another thing I don't talk about. Maybe I should. And so I think Locke's understanding of Newton actually advances quite a bit after he reads the Principia. And then there's also there's an essay by I.B. Cohen, Bernard Cohen, where he talks about all the early reviews of the Principia, and he's very critical of Locke's. He worries that Locke misunderstood things or that had a very shallow understanding. So that's another reason I'm a little bit hesitant to build too much out of the review. Beyond this one point I do make, which is that Locke singles out, what Newton says about attraction. So in the, Newton is very sort of positivist about attraction when he's public facing. He says it's, well, you know what he says. He says, I'm not talking about metaphysics. I'm just talking about any movement together, regardless of the cause of the movement together. So Locke singles that out, and I think that's worth noting, that he sort of identifies that as a positive aspect of Newton's project. But yeah, I'm a little bit uncomfortable building out too much the review, but maybe it's not, as it were, fair to just dump it in at the end and sort of relegate it. And so maybe I should think about reversing the order of presentation and giving it sooner. I don't know if that helps at all or gives more information there.
Yeah, it clarifies a lot, at least that the review itself, it's not a super interesting, philosophically speaking, text. But anyway, we can come back to the issue later on. There is a question from Karin, please.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Patrick, for the presentation and the paper. I enjoyed reading it. And I agree with Marco that it might be useful to put not only the review, but also the other historical information about what Locke knew about Newton at which point in time, to put all of that in a first more historical section, so that non-specialist readers, know what Locke had access to and so on, and to get this out of the way, and then focus on the more philosophical issues. And I think that in relation to one of the worries that you mentioned, I think that it's really nice to have a paper on Locke and Newton, which is on a very interesting question as to what extent can Locke, given his own epistemological principles, support the type of demonstrations put forward by Newton. I think that's very nice. And I think that at least what I took from the paper is that you're basically trying to compare Locke's and Newton's epistemological commitments. And maybe in the case of Newton, it's not that easy. But I think that ideally that would be the question: yes, to what extent can or to what extent do Locke's epistemological principles allow for the type of epistemological principles that Newton embraces? So I'm not sure if this is exactly your question. Maybe it's a somewhat larger version of the question that you address as regards demonstration. Yeah, so what is a demonstration? What is a valid demonstration? To what extent, how and to what extent can it be achieved? But I saw a kind of larger question concerning the compatibility of their epistemological commitments. And with regard to demonstration, I thought that throughout the paper, maybe there are three versions that are at play. The more scholastic one, where we assume that we have access to essences. Then the type of demonstration that Locke takes himself to be carrying out in the essay, which is a matter of comparing ideas. And then the one that he takes Newton to carry out in natural philosophy, which is different, evidently, from just comparing ideas. And to me, it was not completely clear how you see the relationship between the second and the third. Yes, because they both oppose the scholastic one, but then they provide alternatives that are, as it were, modern, but deal with different domains. And one could ask the question whether there is something that the two demonstrations have in common at all. Yeah, because they deal with very different subject matter. So maybe there are a bunch of questions here. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's wonderful. Thanks so much for that, Brian. I like this suggestion of wouldn't it be useful to have all the historical stuff at hand, or to, as it were, present all the historical matter so we know what Locke knew when, or what Locke was exposed to when, some kind of timeline, but then also in a way to put up a buffer, right, or to have some clearer demarcation between what's, as it were, the historical sort of scholarly work of the project versus what's like the philosophical or rational reconstruction work of the paper. And as it stands, it might be that they're too mixed, or that they don't get presented in the right order. And so I really like the idea, because obviously we're all historians of philosophy and science. Obviously they're both important, but that there could be real value to separating them out in that way. But also what you say as well is really helpful about three kinds of demonstration. The scholastic story about scientia, and that comes ultimately from, I don't know, the posterior analytics or somewhere, and then this Lockean theory, which is very, as it were, self-contained to the project of the essay, or to the new way of ideas, Port Royal or whatever. And then what is Newton doing, and how is Newton thinking about demonstration? And I think you're right that I wasn't clear enough that that's, as it were, an autonomous enterprise in a way, and that Newton has his own understanding of these things, and that it's clearly, as you say, not a scholastic one, maybe a reaction to a scholastic one, but that it's also clearly, Newton read Descartes and read Hobbes and ultimately read Locke, but it's pretty obvious he's not thinking about this by means of ideas, or by means of a faculty psychology. And I think I didn't give it that kind of autonomy that it deserved. It's a little bit hard, Newton certainly is not very reflective in public about these things, and he's also not super reflective in private about these things. I mean, maybe some of you have other views on that, but I think even just acknowledging that would be helpful. And I like what you say as well, as you pointed out, it's one of the things I'm struggling with, but in a way, there's a sort of compare and contrast situation with Locke and Newton. And I think what I'd been motivated to do was to set like Newton up as some paragon or something, and then talk about ways in which Locke could like approximate the Newtonian ideal or something. Locke could work his way to the glories of Newtonian demonstration, but I think maybe that's actually misguided or counterproductive. Maybe it would be better to say, Locke has his developed, coherent, self-contained conception of knowledge, and self-developed, coherent, self-contained conception of demonstration. And then the question is, how can you slot, maybe not Newton himself in, but how can you slot some kind of understanding of Newton into that structure? And that would be a way of getting a difference between these two figures. We're not talking about Newton himself. We're talking about Locke's understanding. I think that might be helpful. Maybe just a little bit of background. I mean, I can say I've spoken to people about this, and I've gotten some referee reports on this paper, and very, very often people say, Newton's really complicated. He's way more complicated than you make Newton look here. And I want to say, yes, absolutely right. Newton's really complicated, way more complicated than I make him look here. And they say, well, either Locke then doesn't have the resources to understand Newton, or Locke has some crummy understanding of Newton, and neither of those is interesting. But I think I really like your suggestion, and it might be a way to still, have value in the paper, despite the paper not doing maybe full justice or as much justice as it should to Newton's own understanding. So I don't know if that is responsive, but I found what you said really generative, and so I'm grateful. I'll have to think more about that.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. And so next on the list is Rafael, please.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for the paper. I really liked it, and I think I'm convinced. But there's a question that I wish you had given more detail on. If we see Newton's theory from Locke's perspective as consisting in demonstrations, even though it does not consist in science in the strict sense of the term at the time, what kind of an intellectual project is Newton pursuing according to Locke? Is it really natural philosophy, or is it mathematics, as some of the quotes you give us could suggest? And a follow-up to this question is whether Newton's achievements couldn't be seen as scientific if they do not belong to the field of natural philosophy, in which science is not really possible, but to mathematics.
Yeah, thanks, Rafael. That's a really good question. It's one I've thought a lot. I've thought not a lot about. I've thought some about. And there is a perspective in the literature which is sympathetic to the idea that Locke appreciated Newton and had a huge respect for Newton as a mathematician. So Mary Domsky, I think, is the person who has this understanding of Locke. And so I have two thoughts about that, and then some more thoughts about, well, what is Newton doing? If not, if he doesn't know the essences of things, like what could he be doing? So one thought of it is on the mathematics front. I mean, I think it's obvious Locke had huge respect for Newton's mathematical prowess. Everybody in this period has huge respect for Newton's mathematical prowess, and very often Locke says things, that show that he's thinking about Newton as a mathematician and praising him as a mathematician. But I guess I would say, in response to that, though, I think there are other places where Locke says it's not just mathematics, it's mathematics as applied to the frame of the universe, or mathematics as applied to nature. And there's a point where he's writing to Stillingfleet, and he says, he contrasts him with Aristotle on this point. He said, if only Aristotle had been smart enough to apply mathematics to nature, you would think he was great, and you'd think that Newton's project was great because he was doing what Aristotle did. So that's one way in which I want to say, it's not, as it were, purely mathematical, or the project isn't purely mathematical. The other thing that I was really persuaded by, I read a paper by Zvi Biener about Thomas Hobbes in the first instance. But one of the things that Biener did that I found so fascinating was he tracked through English language uses of mathematics in the late 17th century. And one of the things that he convinced me was that mathematics had a much wider scope, or a much wider definition than we use for it now. So I think now when we talk about mathematics, we use it to mean formal mathematics or pure mathematics or something like that, and we contrast it maybe with applied mathematics. But one of the things that Zvi's paper convinced me of is that mathematics in this period actually covers all kinds of things, including like physico-mathematics or mixed mathematics, things that we would now call like physics, I guess. And so it seems to me, even if Locke is saying Newton is among the finest of the mathematicians, that might actually be telling us Newton is among the best of the physicists. So I guess I'm kind of hyper aware just linguistically of the imprecision, I guess, or the wide semantic scope that mathematics has in this period. And I want to be careful not to overly constrain it in that way. But then your question's a really good one, right? So it's like, well, Newton doesn't have essences. And Newton himself is very upfront about this. I'm not giving you essences. And that gives rise to readings of Newton that are sort of positivist, or, readings of Newton that make him just do mathematics. Or I've been thinking a lot about Dmitry Levitin's recent book, which presents this very like non-metaphysical, very sanitized kind of Newton that's killed philosophy or something. So I guess I have two thoughts, like what it is that Newton could be doing, even though he doesn't have the essences of material objects. Here's one thought about what Newton could be doing. He's saying, I don't have the full essences of material objects, but in this scholastic model of scientia, you're supposed to start with like the queen of the sciences, metaphysics, which is the study of being qua being, and then you deduce out a bunch of truths using your beautiful syllogistic method, and you get some results. But then in that scientia model, you then have subordinated or subaltern sciences beneath metaphysics. So, you then might have, say, physics beneath that. And so then we'll have the truths of physics, or the principles of physics, and we'll be able to construct out a whole nother scheme from those. And then we'll have our findings from physics. But then we'll have a still further subalternate or subordinated science. I don't know, chemistry or zoology or whatever. I don't know exactly how it all works. So, I mean, there's one view, which is that Newton has given us something like a demonstrative system. And it's a demonstrative system, but it's not one that has, as it were, a science above it. So it's incomplete in the sense that it sort of starts midstream. It starts some of the way down. And that, and Newton sometimes gestures at this view. He says, I've only given this. Maybe now we have this, we'll be able to work our way up to the more foundational truths. Or, maybe future generations will discover, say, the cause of gravity. And the cause of gravity might be, as it were, the superior science that we slot in above whatever happens in the Principia. So, I mean, that's one kind of thing that I think is very much in the background for these people, insofar as they're aware of this scholastic heritage, or insofar as they're aware of people in the period like John Sargent, who are still sort of pushing for this model. I guess another thing I'm tempted to say, well, if it's not just mathematics, what is it that Locke thinks Newton is giving us? I guess I'm tempted to say he's giving us the best we can have in natural philosophy. So it's not a science of natural philosophy, but in the same way Boyle is giving us the best we can have in natural philosophy by putting things in air pumps and, leaving things out in the cold and seeing if they shrink, or whatever it is Boyle's doing. I guess he's thinking he's attending to the observable qualities of physical objects and trying to learn things about the observable qualities of physical objects. And the essences are always going to be hidden to us, at least for Locke. Locke's understanding is we'll never get the essences. Maybe Newton doesn't have that understanding. But this is the best we can hope for, at least in this life. Maybe in the next life, God will, as it were, shine the beam into our minds and all will be revealed. But so I guess I think Locke does think Newton's doing natural philosophy. It's just his conception of natural philosophy is of an enterprise that's fundamentally limited and constrained and problematic. But I guess I would want to resist the idea that he thinks Newton's just a mathematician or doing something completely abstracted from material objects. So he's a big book 3 person, I guess. Does that did that track your question? And
yes, absolutely. Thanks.
Thanks, Raphael.
Great. So next on the list is Dino, please.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Now, I wanted to ask you a question on science, which is kind of close to Rafael's question, and question on demonstration, which is closer to Karin's question. Now, on the question of science and ciencia, right? I mean, I kind of remember your tempo talk from Denver, and what you just said now is that there's much more to ciencia than what you've said on page 4, and and you've just said stuff about that. Now, my question is, when Locke uses the term science, how thick is it? Because at some points it seems to me that it's exhaustible just by demonstrative knowledge, right? Now you do talk about like scientific demonstrations, which in this case would be a pleonasm, right? If Locke himself by science simply means demonstrative knowledge, unlike intuitive and the third one, which I can't remember. So that's, so what is science for Locke? We know what scientia is now, but how much of that is in Locke's conception of science? Now, when it comes to demonstration, I liked your kind of short description of it on page 19, concatenation of intuitive knowledge, right? It's very well put, I think. But my question is this: so for Locke, to demonstrate is to have this, chain of intuitive cognitions, intuitive knowledges. And it seems to me that doesn't need to be opposed to the scholastic or the Newtonian view from Locke's perspective. Because I guess what Locke could say is, well, whatever scholastics think they're doing, if they're doing demonstrations, they're doing concatenations of intuitive knowledges. And he does say that in mathematics, real essence and nominal essence overlap, which means you can have demonstration from real essences, if I remember Locke correctly. So you can do something like scholastics want to do, but in mathematics, right? But what demonstration as such is a concatenation of intuitive knowledge. Now, my question is, how wide was that idea of demonstration? Because it seems to me when you look at the rationalists, they would not like something like that, because it doesn't give you the idea of the whole of the syllogism and stuff like that. It's a kind of partialist step-by-step view. You can't make a judgment of a kind of whole inference, right? So like, yeah, how weird is Lockean position? Because I don't think it's necessarily incompatible with others, but it's from Locke's perspective, but still might be weird. Hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I was thinking about your tempo talk on Feigl, and him as like somebody willing to very much die on the hill of this Aristotelian model of knowledge as well. So I guess one thing to say, I've been teaching a seminar for our philosophy majors on Locke this semester, and we just finished book 3, where Locke is almost furious on the point that we need to be consistent in our use of words, and if the words don't match ideas, and if we vary our words from our ideas, we're abusing language. And all my students were like, come on, this guy, like, he's all over the place with language. He's like the biggest abuser there is in this sense. And so I guess I was thinking about, you said science, right? And how thick or thin is the conception of science? Could science just be any demonstration? Or does science have to mean this very, very technical notion of scientia that, I'm kind of insisting it means? So one thing I did, I think, several years ago, but your question is making me think I should do again, is run a text search, a corpus search on science in Locke. But when I did that last time, basically what I found out is the word science is variable in Locke's mouth. So sometimes he has this very, 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 very loose sense of science. So he says, Boyle and Sydenham and Huygens and Newton are master builders who built monuments to posterity in the sciences. So their sciences clearly just means like learned disciplines, it's something just very trivial. But there are other places where you can find him using science in this very technical sense, where it's demonstrations from self-evident propositions, like his language, self-evident proposition, where I think that has to be this very technical sense of scientia. I guess what I don't know is whether he's ever going to use science to mean mere demonstration. I hope he doesn't. If he does, I think that's probably not great for me, or it means I have more work to do textually, sort of sorting that out. So thanks for that. I need to go back and look at just this linguistic point and get this sorted out. So two other thoughts kind of in response to your question, and then the meat of your question. I mean, one, I think you're right that Locke is actually sometimes much more conciliatory towards scholastic demonstration than he lets on. So you can find him saying really nasty things about like syllogism, for instance. You know, you can find him being hypercritical of syllogism, but you can also find him being very conciliatory towards syllogism. And I think I wrote a short piece about this. You know, I think what's going on is that he thinks that he's basically doing psychologistic logic, and he thinks that the formal logic of the Aristotelian syllogistic is just a way of presenting what's going on at the ground level. You know, so the ground level during demonstration and during knowledge, there's just comparison of ideas and understanding of ideas, and he thinks that what the syllogistic does is just dress that up in very fancy clothes. And he thinks people have been overawed by the formal apparatus of the syllogistic, but really they'd be better off focusing on their ideas. He also seems to think the syllogism is great, and scholastic forms of demonstration are great for presenting knowledge you already have. So for communicating or conveying knowledge you've already attained, they're great. But I think for him, in the context of discovery, they're useless. You know, syllogisms don't help you learn anything. They're not a method to knowledge, as these people would say. So I think in that sense, you know, that is a point where Locke does have some appreciation for, or does have a way of sort of making friends with this other alternative approach. But I think, you know, where the rubber hits the road, or where the seas are going to part, really is with this question about essences. And as you point out, you know, mathematics are special for Locke, so you have that absolutely right. You know, the nominal and the real essence of triangle are aligned for Locke. The nominal and the real essence of circle, whatever. You know, so in geometry, we do have a science in the scientia sense. Locke thinks that Euclid gave us a scientia of geometry, and that's all to the good. The question, though, is when you switch over to physics, you know, where Locke very much doesn't think that, say, rational animal is the essence of human, you know, there you're going to start to have these problems about how to do demonstration in natural philosophy. So here's one thing I thought for a while when I first started working on this paper is Locke's trying to do some kind of mixed mathematics, or Locke has the room for some kind of mixed mathematics where you do demonstrations about geometry, and then you, as it were, you construct models, and then you apply the models to the things in nature. You know, and then you can have, like, as it were, the good vibes of geometry because you get the proper demonstrations. But then, you know, there's always going to be this problem about, like, how good the model is. Like, is it actually isomorphic to the phenomena? Does it actually apply? And then it seemed to me Locke was going to have, as it were, insurmountable difficulties there in some sense. So here's my other thought is, well, that's not the picture. The picture is something like, no, we genuinely observe features of bodies. Like, I know where Jupiter moves, and I know how quickly Jupiter moves. And I know, you know, I'm trying to find, got the essay here. You know, I know how much this object weighs. I know its weight. And if I drop it, I can track the rate of its fall. And so, like, really, I'm doing demonstrations about substances. But here's what's interesting. Quantity gives us this kind of leverage because quantity ideas are modal in a way. So in some sense, like, modes are things that depend on substances, but we know about the modes that the substances have. And that's what lets us have that happy meeting between, you know, as it were, the content of the idea and the demonstration going through. And that's what lets us, as it were, like quarantine out the bad parts of the idea of the book, its real essence or whatever, and just focus on these very tractable ones. So you're asking like kind of how widespread is that in this period? I don't know. I mean, I guess there are people in this period trying to do the modeling picture, you know, the mixed mathematics picture. And I guess I'm pretty persuaded that's not what Locke's doing. Maybe it actually is what Newton's doing. It kind of looks like that. You know, book 1, book 2 give you models. Book 3 gives you application. There's a lot of people in the period who think we know the essences of the things, like the Cartesians, you know, they just think we know the essence is extension. And so we can, you know, just go from there. I don't know how many people in this period have the Lockean view. I guess I should think about that if that's the question you were asking. So I don't know. That was a lot, and I'm not sure I actually got all the way to the question at the end of your question. But those are some things I'm struggling with.
No, that was great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Dina.
Thank you very much. Next is Ovidiu.
Right. Thank you so much, Patrick. I really enjoyed your paper. So, like one general thing connected to what you were saying at the beginning, whether you should frame the paper more as a Locke paper or more as a like Newton paper. I'm kind of totally on board with how it looks now, and that so I've read it like a Locke paper per se. So how I've read it was something like this, given that I don't know my Locke. So I read it like, you know, Locke's epistemology has to have some sort of normative component for natural philosophy, right? So it has to be able to say natural philosophy should be constrained in some way. And this probably is because, you know, substances are weird, we can never know their essence and stuff like that. But wait, given all this normative force, there is a way in which we can have demonstration, right? Which is not about the essences of substances, but about particular modes and so on. And somehow, incidentally or not, this way aligns with how he understood Newton, right? I mean, basically, this is what I got, like very broadly speaking. And I think I actually think this is a very nice way of putting it. I wouldn't put so much weight on how specifically this aligns to how other people have understood Newton, because I guess that can be very, very, that can open up like a Pandora's box and like never end, right? Maybe one thing which you could tell me a bit would be something like this. What about, so is this type of demonstration which Locke admits for natural philosophy, do you think this would apply to any degree for instance, Boyle, or for instance, Sydenham? So any other of the master builders Locke is mentioning? Because if it does, so if Locke would believe, you know, Boyle pretty much has the same type of demonstration in his natural philosophy, then you don't really need Newton that much, right? So somehow Newton aligns to this rigor, right? But if you think Locke wouldn't allow Boyle, for instance, to have the same demonstrative knowledge in his natural philosophy, then maybe you could explain a bit more what's so special about Newton, as it were. So I realize this is very vague, but I guess what I'm asking is this. So Boyle has some sort of matter theory, right? Which is different, arguably, than Newton's. How much weight does this play in Locke's appraisal of Boyle's whole science of matters of fact compared to Newton's demonstrative knowledge?
Yeah, thanks, Vidya. That's a great question. Well, first of all, I'm thrilled to hear you think the paper works as it is. Other things equal, I'd rather not radically rewrite it, but so that's helpful, and the way you characterized it, I think, is accurate. And and the more I could do to make clear that that's the right characterization, I think the better off I'd be. And so I want to take up your suggestion of not putting very much weight on how people understand Newton, because as you say, Pandora's box is definitely the right word. You know, it just gets very complicated very fast. So yeah, I love the point about other master builders. So for those who haven't been poring over the essay nonstop, you know, there's this famous moment in the epistle to the reader where Locke identifies what he calls master builders who are going to leave monuments to posterity in the sciences. So these are the people Locke thinks are really great. Locke says, I'm not one of them. I'm a mere underlaborer, you know, just trying to like clear the ground for their totally awesome work, you know. And it's interesting because the four people he names are Boyle, Robert Boyle, Thomas Sydenham, Isaac Newton, who he says is incomparable, so Newton's the best of these, and then Christian Huygens. So your question was about, well, demonstration and like, where does demonstration fit in? You know, and does Locke have a wider view of demonstration in natural philosophy, or are there other natural philosophers that Locke thinks are doing demonstrations? Or are there other kinds of knowledge being acquired or attained by natural philosophers that aren't demonstrative? So like, how would Newton compare to Boyle or to Sydenham? So I think there's a lot to say there. People have written a lot about Locke and Boyle. People have written a lot about Locke and Sydenham. Nobody's written like anything about Locke and Huygens, which I find very, very interesting, given that Huygens is on this list. I mean, maybe this reflects like Anglophone biases in the Locke literature or something. I don't know. So I guess one thing I would say is like Huygens is obviously somebody proffering demonstrations. Huygens is somebody who has a different understanding than Newton, right? So Huygens has various constraints, namely contact action, you know, and somebody will correct me if I'm wrong about this. I think Huygens is a Plenist as well, in a way that, you know, Locke and Newton are much more skeptical of Plenism. So I guess I'd say that's one instance in which Locke clearly thinks here's somebody offering us constructive, positive work I approve of in natural philosophy that's employing demonstrations, maybe not identical to Newtonian demonstrations, but very much in the same vein or very much in the same ballpark, I guess we'd say in America, as Newton. You know, Sydenham is somebody very much not doing that. So Sydenham is a surgeon, is a doctor. You know, so Sydenham has no pretensions towards a demonstrative theory of medicine. He's not like Pitcairn or Shane or somebody. And Sydenham's kind of a skeptical influence on Locke is the main thought. You know, Sydenham is distrustful of essences. He's distrustful of anatomy and physiology. You know, he says, just look at the symptoms of the disease. Just see what people with those symptoms, what happened in the past. Just treat, you know, just try and derive a case study or an etiology of the disease and then treat like cases alike. But don't go positing mechanisms, don't go positing deeper, as it were, metaphysical or physiological explanations for disease. Just keep it as it were, at that surface level. So that seems like a big distance, you know, between Sydenham and his kind of deal, his methodology, and Newton. You know, Boyle's an interesting case because, like you say, Boyle has this whole developed matter theory. You know, he's at some moments he's very sort of dogmatic, you know, about the way nature works. And he's very confident, you know, about the corpuscularian matter theory he's developed, and that, you know, the affections of matter, motion, shape, whatever it is, and contact action being the only way things work. You know, at other moments, Boyle's a little bit more skeptical. It looks like he has maybe a bit of time for like emergent chemical properties and weird stuff. And then at still other moments, Boyle is just doing a project of natural history. You know, so like the natural history of the air, for instance, which Locke takes over when Boyle dies and actually sees through the press. You know, that's just about like how cold it got in Oslo last year or whatever, or, you know, like whether you can compress air, you know, more this way rather that way, or, you know, so it's very Sydenhamian, and that it's sticking to this very surface level kind of thing. So I guess I'd be curious, like your questions made me want to think a lot more about demonstrations in the context of Boyle. You know, I don't know that Boyle ever presents himself as somebody offering demonstrations. And I guess I'm trying to think about the kinds of reasoning Boyle offers for thinking about why we can be so confident on the basis of tables and chairs and coffee cups that the fundamental level of nature is these corpuscles, you know, so these arguments from, what do they call it, transduction, you know, and I guess there's some rule 3 of the Principia kind of stuff there that's a little bit interesting. But I guess so I'm rambling now, just like moaning about Boyle, but I guess what I would say is I'm not confident that Locke would see Boyle as offering demonstrations. I am confident he sees Huygens as offering demonstrations. And so I guess I'd say mixed verdict in response to your question. You know, are there other places where Locke thinks demonstration happens in natural philosophy? I guess I want to say, yeah. Is Boyle one of them? I guess I'd probably want to say no. You know, maybe just one other quick thing is pendulum experiments, you know, are so important in this period. And who is it? Is it Picard actually goes from Paris to Cayenne, like in Suriname, to try and get time the pendulum at the equator so they can figure out the shape of the Earth? Or they, you know, Locke's living in the period where they realize that the time of a pendulum of equal lengths differs depending on your latitude. And I guess Locke's super abreast of that, you know, like Locke is super aware of that. And so I think that's another case in which he's pretty clearly thinking that there's avenues for demonstration in natural philosophy that are going to yield substantive knowledge. So this is super helpful. Maybe this is another avenue for doing some of what Marco and Karin were suggesting about trying to bring forward some of this historical content that probably is super relevant earlier in the paper, and as it were, put Locke in that space a little bit more before I jump right into here's a demonstration, here's a substance, here's a mode, here's a whatever. I don't know. So
do you have a follow-up?
I don't know
if you want to continue.
Yeah, if I may have just a short. Yeah, so right. So this is super interesting. So so you're saying basically that, you know, what makes in Locke's mind, what makes Newton's Principia a demonstration, unlike Boyle, let's say, is not necessarily the matter of fact business, but it has more to do with the quantity business, right? So it has to be some, I mean, you of course said this in the paper, but I mean, if you think this is the case, I think you could emphasize this a bit more.
Yeah.
So basically the demonstrative aspect of which Locke believes Newton to have might not be there in Boyle, because Boyle, even though he arguably, or from time to time, he stays at the like phenomenal level, still he doesn't quantify. He doesn't like to quantify that much. And in this case, something is left out.
Yeah, nice.
Although now I'm wondering if this is the case, why is it the case? Because I mean, Locke could say, well, you know, we have substances which are confused and whatever, but we can split them into constituent ideas which need not be quantitative, right? In order to be comparable, in order to be clear. So why do you think this is?
Yeah.
Or am I not? Probably it doesn't make sense, but
No. This makes perfect sense. This is great. So, two kind of big picture thoughts. One is, I think you're totally right that there's something really important between some of the work that Boyle is doing and some of the work that Newton is doing, and this point about quantity is essential. You know, I think Locke doesn't think that quantity is necessary for demonstration, but quantity makes demonstration just so much better because it allows for a much more precise comparing of ideas. So And with qualities, that's much, much, much harder. You know, so think about color, for instance. You know, Boyle writes A Natural History of Color. You know, with color, it's very difficult to be precise in these ways. So now we can do this, right? Because we have the Pantone system and we have spectrometers or whatever it is, you know, so we can now be much more precise about color. But, you know, if you think about that phenomenon of going to the home improvement store and you're looking at all the paint chips, you know, it can be very difficult to say, well, that one's bluer than that one. Well, how much bluer is it? No, I want a really deep blue for the walls of my study. I don't want a light blue. Well, you know, and we have all these language, you know, I want lavender, I want royal blue, I want cyan, I don't know, whatever. But we struggle, right? You know, like we can't be precise in that way. You know, you can't, that's not twice as blue as that. It just doesn't quite. Whereas when you have quantities, it's very easy to say that's twice as heavy as that, that's moving twice as fast as that, that's twice as dense as that. So I think you're absolutely right that there's something really, really important about the quantity quality distinction. I'd give a shout out to Anat Shechtman, who's been working on these issues in Locke, and she has a series of just beautiful, like genuinely beautiful papers in which she lays all this out in super clarity. And she has this great example of Alexander von Humboldt. So when Alexander von Humboldt is traveling in South America, in Ecuador and in Peru, he actually has this instrument called a cyanometer. And what the cyanometer is it's a circle and it's got shades of blue, little patches of blue all around you can Google this thing, it's amazing. Little patches of blue all around, getting lighter to darker, and they have little numbers on them. And so as von Humboldt's climbing this volcano in Ecuador or in Peru, every like 15 minutes or whatever, he's stopping and he's holding the cyanometer up to the sky, and it's got a little hole in the center. And then the trick is to look through the hole and then record the number of the blue of the sky that corresponds to the color on your cyanometer. And so Anat has this wonderful paper where she tries to build this out and say, well, would this let us construct a demonstrative science of color, you know, along these lines? And I think that's a super interesting question. So that was one really big picture thought, and I think you're right, and I think it's probably it's not something I bring out in this paper, but it's something that the paper would benefit from saying more about. The way you put it, it's not just demonstrations that matter in Newton, it's that the demonstrations are possible because of quantity. Here's one other just really big picture thought about the difference between Newton and Boyle. And there's a lot of Newton expertise here, so I'd love to hear if people agree with this. There's something really mysterious about the Principia. Well, there's lots, but it's like you start, Newton goes, here are the laws of motion. Now I'm going to show you what happens with these laws of motion. I'm just going to, you know, show you how bodies moving in space work. I'm going to show you how collisions work. I'm going to show you blah, 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 blah. And if you have a force of gravity, here's what the laws of motion are going to mean for it, and so on and so forth. And it's like, okay, where did the laws of motion come from? Like, why are these the right laws of motion? You know, like, why, Newton, where did you find these? Like, did the angel of the Lord whisper them to you in a dream? Did you guess? You know, and in some sense, the proof of the laws being correct is that we're supposed to do the demonstrations, then we're supposed to see that, oh, great, these demonstrations actually track the phenomena. You know, so if, as it were, correct predictions follow from the laws, then we know that those are the right laws. Fair enough. But that's still, you know, it's like, where did the laws come from? And I guess what I'm getting at is one thing I think the Principia masks in virtue of its order of presentation is I think Newton thinks that these laws are actually inductive generalizations. So we didn't start with the laws. We actually started by looking at the night sky, and we started with the Rudolphine tables, and we started with Kepler doing, you know, like inductive generalization. And so what the laws actually are is inductive generalizations. And so I think even by the time you open the second page of the Principia, there's already this like huge project, you know, that existed to get you to law 1, 2, and 3. And so I guess what I think in Locke's view, what that is natural history. So like the first stage of any natural philosophy is natural history, the kind of thing Boyle's doing, the kind of thing Sydenham's doing for disease. And it's only once you've done all that natural history and you have these inductive generalizations, or you have these principles, maybe they're not like strict principles, that you're in a position to do demonstration. And ideally you'd need quantities as well. But I guess I just wanted to say something about that. And I think that's a big difference between Boyle and, you know, Boyle's mostly a natural historian for Locke. And that's another reason he's not doing demonstration, is that maybe someday, you know, I think Locke's view is hopefully someday we will know enough about rocks from doing natural history that we'll have a Newton of geology. But we're not there yet. We don't know enough about rocks. We can't do demonstrations with them. Anyway, that was long-winded, but yeah.
I also have a question or two I will start with, which is more like one which is more of a comment or a general curiosity rather than a critique. So as far as I could understood by reading the paper and from this discussion, and I read the paper as a paper on Locke and Newton, not just a Locke paper as the video was mentioning. But basically for Locke, natural philosophy is about substances, then it cannot yield any demonstrative knowledge. What about Newton? Well, Newton doesn't talk about substances, but more about relations or quantifiable properties or only certain properties, typically attraction. And so if this is the very, very simplified picture Locke gives us and that you brilliantly reproduced or analyzed, I was wondering, what about certain theses or things that are in Newton's Principia from the first edition, which are not substances, so they would not be, strictly speaking, the object of natural philosophy, nor are quantifiable or properties or relations in Locke's sense, for instance, absolute space and absolute time, which are I guess, in this column to the definitions since the first edition, if I'm correct. But Newton insists these are not substances, but at the same time, how could Locke accept in a natural philosophy absolute space or absolute time? That would sound weird. So, but this is, of course, it's not your responsibility, but it's more of a Locke being blind to certain issues. And then I have a second question, but on a totally unrelated topic. So if you want to react to this, I will let you do it.
Yeah, thanks, Margot. So two things. One is so space and time in a second, but I guess if I'm fully honest, I think the paper I think I worry sometimes I present a sort of sleight of hand or a sort of bait and switch on the paper, right? Because your characterization was just right, you know. So I say Locke thinks we can have demonstrations with modes and relations, and so you can have demonstrations in mathematics and in ethics. Locke doesn't think we have good knowledge of substances. Natural philosophy deals with substances, so no demonstrations in natural philosophy. You know, I think that's like the setup. And then I ended up saying, wait, no, that's not right. We can't have demonstrations in natural philosophy. But then I'm really, really cagey about the way I characterize those sometimes. So I say something like, well, it's demonstrations that involve substances, or it's like demonstrations, I'm trying to think how I put it, like substance, you know, demonstrations involving substance ideas or something. But I mean, I think, you know, you pointed out in a way, you could think about the Principia as just presenting us with mode and relation ideas, you know, quantity of matter, quantity of motion, those kinds of things. In which case, Locke thinks we can have demonstrations in natural philosophy, but the demonstrations are really, it's really modal ideas and ideas of relations that, as it were, are the engine or are the ingredients for the demonstrations. And so there's something kind of, I worry I sort of cheat a little bit, where in the end of the day, the demonstrations involve substance ideas, but they're not really demonstrations about substances. They're demonstrations about modes that belong to the substance. So I think if I were grumpier than all of you or more critical than all of you, you know, I might be worried about this, or I might think that I'm cheating somehow. So I just wanted to flag that. But you're asking about space and time, and there's something really interesting going on with space and time in Locke, I guess I would say. Which is that in his early journal notes from the 1670s, Locke's a committed relationalist about space and time. By draft C of the essay, there's scholarly dispute. There's a few people who disagree, but the consensus is that he's a committed absolutist about space and time. And Locke has not met Newton before that conversion. So Locke becomes a committed absolutist about space and time, but not because of the Principia and not because of anything to do with Newton. So there's something really interesting, and you were presenting this in terms of, well, you know, Newton says about space and time, maybe not in the general, maybe he doesn't say this in the Scholium, but certainly in like De Gravitatione, you know, he says they're neither substances nor accidents, they have their own kind of being or something like that. And Locke uses that exact same locution in the essay. So he says, if you ask me what space and time are, you'll probably think you have me, because you'll say they're either substances or accidents, and they're surprised they're neither, you know. And that's a line of thought that goes all the way back to like Patrizzi and various other people. I think maybe it's in Gassendi, maybe it's in like Charlton. I'm not 100% sure. So I guess there's something interesting. You know, I don't speak about space and time in this paper. It might be worth saying something about them. And I think they are a little bit on the, as it were, metaphysical side. Locke's very happy to say that they're sui generis, or they're, you know, they're space and time. What more can I say? But it is interesting in the idea, as it were, in the theory of ideas, he wants to analyze them as modes. So he's pretty clear that space and time are modal ideas. And actually, maybe you've helped me realize this. Maybe this is super helpful insofar as either absolute or relative space and time matter for what Newton is doing. It's probably to Locke's advantage if space and time are modal ideas rather than substance ideas, because if they were substance ideas, they'd start to cause problems. Whereas, as it were, if they're modal ideas, then the demonstrations he'll have a cleaner path to success with the demonstrations. So there's something really deep and helpful there. Thanks.
Yeah, but in general, I'd like to say that when you were presenting the relationship between Locke and Newton and how could Locke still appreciate the content of the Principia from his perspective, it sounded convincing. So I'm not a Locke scholar, but it sounded convincing to the argument. So I had nothing to say on that. And another comment, which goes in a totally different direction, and it's not super relevant to your argument, but I wanted to mention it. So even in your presentation earlier on, you talked about Locke's stay in France and how important that was and so on. And while I was reading the paper before our meeting, so I saw page 13, you talk about this Picard, Roemer, Huygens, and so on, who are mathematical physicists rather than natural historians. So I guess pointing in the direction they kind of not prepared the way for Locke's acceptance of Newton, but opened up Locke's mind towards mathematical physics, which will also be practiced by Newton. And so I know some of these guys, and from my perspective, so I would not characterize these as mathematical physicists, in the sense that, of course, they're not natural historians, in the sense they're not purely empirical savants, but at the same time, they're not doing, at least perhaps Huygens is, but and Roemer in part, but Picard and Cassini are not doing mathematical physics in the sense Newton is doing mathematical physics. These are observational astronomers and cartographers. And you know, even when they conduct these quantitative experiments, you were mentioning the pendulum. So Picard was there to observe the stars and do some ethnographic observations, and he also tried the pendulum. But so these were kind of in between the empirical, the purely empirical Baconian perspective and mathematical physics, rather than already mathematicians and physicists in the sense of Newton. But this maybe can also be, I mean, interesting for your perspective. But I would just, well, this is the comment.
Thanks. I mean, all I can do is defer. I know you've been working on the French context and figures like this. And so, I mean, I guess I had always felt a bit, you know, mathematical physics is like not a, these disciplinary configurations are so hard, you know. I feel like anytime you say like physical mathematics or, you know, mechanics or any of these, you know, it's always easy to problematize those. But I mean, you're absolutely right. The mathematical physics is pretty loaded. And the very little I know about like Cassini, I can see how, right, he's not trying to do something constructive, I guess I would say, in the way that maybe like Newton's and Huygens. You know, Romer is interesting though, right? Because Romer does, at least with respect to the speed of light on the basis of Jupiter's moons, I guess I feel like Romer does take himself to have like demonstrated a physical fact on the basis of observation and mathematics. But then, yeah, I guess it'd be interesting to think more about Cassini. And so just to channel your thought, you know, if I'm, say, Peter Anstey, so he's one of the people who says that Locke only cares about measurement in the context of natural history. You know, you might say, yeah, and Cassini is compatible with that, right? Because what's Cassini doing? Taking observations, and the observations are part of a natural history of the heavens, you know, and sure, you might use numbers for that just to pick out like where in the night sky the thing appeared, but that's not, as it were, a full-blown application of nature in which you're then deriving future locations or coming up with laws that describe the motion. You know, it's just like tables, you know, or something like that. So yeah, so the point's well taken. I should be a lot more nuanced and kind of cautious there. And I should probably learn something about Cassini and Picard as well, if I can, but yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And it's not a big, I mean, critique, just a, you know, small detail. But Ovidio has something else.
Sorry, Marco, sorry to interrupt. I was wondering if one of our PhD students maybe also have questions. Of course, there's no obligation, yes, but no? Okay.
Not yet.
I mean, I can just go ahead, and if anyone else wants to follow up, that would be great. So yeah, so well, one thing which I don't think I have a very clear idea of in your paper is like the last part. So when you talk about Locke and Newton vis-a-vis instructive knowledge, right? So what Locke says, so given that this type of demonstration is the Newtonian, as it were, right? This is still not a trifling one, right? I mean, you do have some sort of synthetic knowledge, right? So you do learn something from this kind of thing. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what the take-home point of this should be. I mean, is this whole thing about, you know, here's how Newtonian demonstrations, and they're wonderful from like a certainty point of view, can still be like fruitful empirically and still teach us and still like evolve and, you know, become this wonderful science and so on? Is it a point about that kind of thing? Or is it a point about, you know, this type of knowledge still teaches us stuff about substances, even though it doesn't talk per se about, it doesn't involve our idea of substances per se? So is Locke here making kind of one of his, like, you know, grand claims about how knowledge should advance and so on? Or is it like a specific epistemic point? Because I kind of can read it in both ways, right? And I wonder if you can talk some more about this, and I might have a follow-up afterwards.
That's awesome, thanks. I wasn't clear about those. And actually, I don't think I'd seen the second possibility prior to you saying it, but I like that, and I hope I want to put that in, and make that work, because I think there's value added. So yeah, you were asking about the trifling instructive knowledge distinction and this claim I make about, you know, what's going on there. And there's stuff about like Lockean real knowledge as well. And so as you were asking, I was trying to remember why I put that material in the paper and failed to remember. I'm sure there was a reason. I guess I was worried about an objection of a certain kind, you know, like.
So if I can just jump in shortly. So you were basically before this, you were saying basically, but what if, even if Newtonian things are demonstration, what if kind of they don't latch onto anything? They're basically just models. And they don't talk about anything in nature, right? I mean, that was the context.
Yeah, super. So I think that if they're just models and they don't latch on, you know, that's really bad. And so, and I did speak to somebody who had this exact worry that, like, sure, all the Lockean demonstrations I talk about are good and they're successful demonstrations, but they're all just demonstrations that, like, if there is something with this mass moving at this velocity, then the thing with that mass at that velocity will, you know, blah, 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 blah. So in some sense, they're purely hypothetical, you know, like, you know, if there were a hippopotamus that could juggle, it could be in a circus. And it's like, yeah, that's true. If there were a hippopotamus that could juggle, it would be in a circus. You know, have I learned anything? You know, it's like, obviously not. That, you know, because there are no hippopotamuses that juggle. And so I guess the real knowledge point, that's where I was trying to say, I think I used the language of like the rubber hitting the road. That's where I was trying to say that it's not an abstract model with no correlate in reality. You know, I was trying to get that there is an anchor, as it were, or that because, you know, it's not just saying if there's an object with such and such a mass moving at such and such a velocity. I'm trying to say, no, we weighed the object, so we know its mass, and we watched it move, so we know its velocity. You know, so as it were, I was trying to get that concrete link such that it's not a mere abstract model. And then we have to wonder, does the model apply? It's like, no, we know the model applies because it was taken from the phenomenon or from our observations. I guess the trifling instructive thing, I guess one thing I'd say is I've never fully understood this distinction in Locke's text, and the literature on this seems to think that the basic idea is good, but that it doesn't work in the end. But I guess I was worried about the following kind of thing. It's like, I say this in the paper, so maybe it's not helpful to repeat, but it's just like, oh, Newton taught us that all bodies mutually gravitate. And here comes Locke. Like, check out my amazing discovery. Check out my really cool demonstration. All bodies gravitate. The sun is a body. Jupiter is a body. The sun and Jupiter gravitate. Haven't I done a really cool demonstration now? Like, aren't we all richer for this knowledge? You know, and I guess I was like, obviously not. You know, there's no light added, as Locke would say. There's no genuine cognitive achievement there. There's just a repetition of what was already known. And so I hadn't thought about that in terms of, you know, fruitfulness, because, or I thought about that in terms of fruitfulness, because, you know, Locke says, if I tell you a triangle has three sides, you're unimpressed, you know. But if I demonstrate the Pythagorean theorem, you know, well, you know the Pythagorean theorem, but like, you know, for a child, if I tell a child that a triangle has three sides, they say, I know, leave me alone. But if I show them the Pythagorean theorem, you know, that's great. They've learned something. They've gotten some fruitfulness. But that's true just with modes, just with triangles. But I guess I was thinking there's something interesting. You know, if I tell you, oh, Jupiter and the sun mutually gravitate, you're going to say, I know, not interesting. But if I say, you know, did you know that on January 1st, 2035, Jupiter will be right there? That's interesting. That's like value added. But I hadn't really thought about that in terms of what you were saying, like tacking on to the substances or actually teaching us about nature rather than just teaching us about modes. And I'd like to build that out because I think that's actually really promising and could be cool or could be valuable.
So Ovidio was.
Can I have a follow-up? But
Yeah.
if someone else wants to go ahead, please do. No, so when I was reading that part, kind of the example the impression I got was, well, look, so Newton's demonstrations are informative, or what's the word, instructive, in that, you know, it's not necessarily that they enable like predictions all the time, but it's like, you know, the law of gravity, so bodies gravitate because of something about mass and distance, right? So I mean, they're kind of, so the substances have multiple ideas, qualities, whatever, and some of these dimensions or quantities are somehow connected, right? I mean, there is a sense in which you can say, well, bodies are attracted because of mass, even if you're not speculating about some causal mechanism or whatnot. And this was my initial kind of, do you agree with this, or do you think that's an inappropriate way of?
No, great. That's great. I had misunderstood, so that's a very helpful clarification. Yeah, what we're going to get leverage on is that there is a visible connection between, say, mass and motion, for example, such that two bodies in absolute space will move towards one another. And so, you know, we know that their rate of motion, as it were, is linked up to their mass. Mm-hmm. So we're going to get that there's what Locke calls a visible connection between this cluster of ideas, right. Mass, distance, motion, time, whatever. And then I was thinking, yeah, and that's like genuine, there's genuine value there. I was trying to get it all out of this predictive thing, but I need to go back and rethink that. And I guess I was thinking, you know, that's instructive in the sense that, like, it's part of the idea of the pen. You know, it's like a normal part of the idea of the pen is that it has a certain like mass. You know, it's not a normal part of the idea of the pen that it's affected by the moon. You know, but like Newton's taught us that. Like, we've now learned something cool about the pen, you know, namely that it's affected by the moon. Maybe the tides are a better example there, because it's a more visible change. But you know, it's not part of the idea of the tides that they're responsive to the moon. But now we've learned they are, I guess. But that's super helpful. I can clean that part of the paper up, I think, hopefully. Yeah.
So, Karin, if your comment or question is a follow-up, please go ahead, because I have a different question to raise.
It's not a follow-up, so please go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Well, my comment or question is actually more of a thought I had while listening to you and then rereading parts of your paper. But at times, what Locke praises of Newton's approach and finds just in Newton's approach seem to be like the contrary than what Descartes is doing. And it occurred to me that you mentioned Descartes a couple of times in the paper, but I mean, it's perhaps that I interpret things through the filter of the old Descartes-Newton alternative and dispute. But I was wondering whether there is anything of this disputed alternative that animated many debates at the time in Locke's choice, as it were, of Newton and the critique of Descartes. And maybe in that perspective, what we were saying before on the trip to France might actually make historically much sense, in the sense that Locke saw that even Cartesians like Huygens or others were actually critical of Descartes' hypothesis and speculations in physics, so that even Cartesians were against this kind of approach that also Newton criticized. But it's just a thought.
Thanks. That's super helpful. I mean, I think there was a view like in the 1970s or something that, you know, like Locke was a nationalist, I guess, in some sense, and so the love for Newton was like driven by anti-French animosity, or he was just siding with his countrymen or siding with his personal friend over this distant figure. And you don't think that's true, or but your comment's helpful. Like, so the Descartes' a villain in Locke's worldview across any number of fronts, like for being an innatist, for conflating matter and body, for being Catholic. You should take your pick. Like there's all kinds of things wrong with Descartes. I guess one thing I was thinking about, is like this time in France in the 1670s. There's also, maybe this is a little bit later, there's this growing recognition in the Royal Society and in France as well, I'm sure, that Descartes' collision laws are totally not apt or not predictive. Maybe it's because they're like beautiful idealizations that don't apply, but, in the Royal Society asks people for better laws of collisions, and Wallace and Wren and Huygens come up with collision laws. And there's one way of thinking about like what's bad about Descartes and what's good about Newton. And one thing you might think that's like bad about Descartes is like inaccuracy, like not being receptive to phenomena. One thing that's awesome about Newton is like accuracy, receptivity to phenomena, accurate predictions. So like respectable or rigorous science or something. And I think Locke's pretty clearly, he's a member of the Royal Society. He reads Philosophical Transactions. I think he probably would have seen this stuff about the collision laws and these worries about Descartes being inaccurate or but I guess I'm really motivated by this idea that Locke sees Descartes as a proponent of scientia, and he takes like the tree model from the Principia seriously, where the roots are metaphysics and the trunk is physics and the branches are medicine or whatever. Because Locke spends so much time criticizing Descartes for conflating body and extension, and just spends so much time trying to break the idea that the principal attribute of body is extension, that anywhere you have extension, you have body. And Newton hates this as well. This is a big thrust of De Gravitatione, is trying to break this Cartesian identification of extension and body and say that body has something that space doesn't have. And so I'm just, you were saying like I sort of bring this contrast out of it. And I think the thing I really want to foreground is the idea that Descartes thinks we know the essence of body, and then tries to, at least in Locke's mind, tries to demonstrate out of physics on the basis of that. And Newton doesn't do that. So I think that's really where I want to situate the conflict, not on grounds of nationality, not on grounds of scientific rigor or accuracy, not on grounds of something to do with divine causation and whatever, conservation. I really think I really want to claim that that's the key difference Locke identifies. So Newton starts with matters of fact because he's been paying attention to the movements of planets. Descartes starts with this dogmatic assumption about what matter is and how matter has to behave, and it leads him into the places it leads him, I guess. So I don't know if that was responsive to the...
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So then Karin had a question, please.
Yes, thanks. Yes, so I wanted to come back to something you earlier mentioned, Patrick, about the term to involve. Yes, so Locke's demonstrations or whatever involve substances, because I was struck by the use of the term and I thought it was pretty vague. And so when you mentioned that you felt it was maybe not appropriate, I agree. So I agree about this. And I was wondering whether you need it. Yes, whether you need to suggest that that Locke was somehow interested in substances. And while reading your paper, I was wondering why you don't stress more that both Newton and Locke are basically interested in relations, and in particular in ways of quantifying. Well, I'm not sure if this is true of Locke as well, but at least they're interested in relations more than in substances. And you give one example. I don't remember exactly what the things were, but you say, well, two things, two objects can be, we can have very confused conceptions of the two objects, but then there are some aspects in which they are clear, namely in terms of their relation. Yes, I can determine that the one is bigger than the other. So that's about a relation. And I don't know if this is if this can be generalized, but it's clear that Locke is very suspicious of the assumption that we can know essences, and the question is whether the two of them don't agree much more on their skepticism concerning essences or substances more generally, and on the other hand their idea that if we're going to achieve knowledge of things, it has to be in view of their relations.
Good, thanks. You've put your finger exactly on the thing that I said I thought I was sort of cheating on, or the thing I said I thought I was being too sneaky with, or whatever. But I guess, so yeah, so I think the example I gave was, if you just bring a subject into a room and there are two spheres sitting on the table, and one is the size of a basketball and one is the size of a tennis ball, it seems like the agent shouldn't make any claims about their weight, because maybe the tennis ball one is really dense and the basketball one isn't, and she shouldn't make any claims about what they taste like. But like, she should be very confident in a relation that obtains between them.
Mm-hmm.
She should be very confident that that one is bigger than that one, and that's
Mm-hmm.
that just seemed to me obvious. It sounds like it seemed to you obvious as well. And so I think what you're pointing out is like, well, look, we've not learned anything about the substances. Like, I don't know anything about the essence of either object, as demonstrated by the fact that I can't delineate out their properties or give you their modal features or anything like that. And so what have I learned about? I've learned about a relation. And I've learned about a relation that obtains in virtue of features the objects have. So it's obtained in virtue of the size of the one sphere and the size of the other sphere. But sizes, I think you would then say the sizes are not substances. The sizes are something downstream from substances, properties, modes, attributes.
Yeah.
Maybe in Lockean terms, modes. And so, your thought is, well, good, great. Now I have physical knowledge. I have physical knowledge of a relation that obtains in virtue of two properties or modes, and
forget about the substances in the case of both Newton and Locke.
But so, here's where I want to resist, though, is I want to say, but haven't I learned something about the two substances on the table, namely that one's bigger than that one?
No, I think you have learned something about the relation between them. So you're comparing representations, and so all the let's say the what's informative about your judgment is precisely the relation, and what the things are in themselves is irrelevant. Well, maybe this is too Kantian. Yes, I'm sorry about that. but we don't ask the question anymore. Yes, what is the cube or this particular figure or milk bottle in itself? We got independently of how it relates to other bodies.
Good. First, it's all Kant all the time here at Hopkins. So I'm always happy to be Kantian. But so I mean, I think we agree, but it's maybe a difference of emphasis. I think you have it exactly right, and this is the genius. This is like so smart in what Newton has done, right? Is he's offered us a way to get leverage on nature through the things that are empirically tractable, And then, as you say, to not cause ourselves anguish on things that are outside of our ken.
Yeah.
I guess here's where I want to, again, repackage those. I want to say, sure, but at the end of the day, Jupiter is a substance and the sun is a substance.
Well, but
And if I've showed that Jupiter moves around the sun in an ellipse, you're totally right. I haven't done that in virtue of Jupiter's essence. But as it were, you know, and I've had this successful strategy where I sort of cordon off, or I sort of, I was thinking about quarantining, you know, I sort of quarantine the nasty substance, the problematic things. But what I want to say is they still sort of come along for the ride. You know, they still sort of manage to sneak into the demonstration such that I've genuinely demonstrated something about Jupiter, not in virtue of its mysterious real essence, in virtue of its tractable features, but
yeah,
Jupiter is involved.
I don't know whether either Newton or Locke would hold this, yes, but I think one could argue that that Jupiter is only relevant as regards the complete set of its relations to other bodies. There's nothing else beyond its set of relations that should be of interest to us.
Yeah. And there are some very suggestive passages where Locke says something like this. You know, he says we're used to thinking about things in isolation, but we don't realize the deep connections. So his example is, you know, a certain animal, you know, that maybe lives in Africa, and we bring the animal to Europe and it dies. And he's like, well, that teaches us that the animal's not a self-contained thing, that there must have been something in the air there, or there must have been something in the environment there that it needed, you know, in order to do what it was doing. And so he says, you know, things might take on a very different face if other things were taken away. So in that sense, I think you're right that sometimes Locke is sympathetic to this kind of holist picture you're offering. And Newton's very clear about this, about gravitation. You know, he says we talk about the sun attracting Jupiter, and we talk about Jupiter attracting the sun, but he says that's actually a confusion. There's one action of mutual attraction between the two. So that's more evidence for your kind of sort of like beautifully, maybe Kantian, sort of like holistic, coherentist picture. At other moments, though, both Locke and Newton are happy to say, well, their bodies are distinct. So I don't know, but there's something really rich there. Think more about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Dino, please.
Hi, thank you. This is a bit free improvising, but on the idea of involving substances and connection to demonstration, because I think one thought I had when you said about this kind of ambiguous involving, is doesn't Locke say that basically in sensible knowledge there is an admixture of the idea of existence, which points out beyond the ideas which are of properties which are given, right? So unlike in abstract thinking and stuff like that, in sensible knowledge, you do have some sort of latching onto a je ne sais quoi underlying it, right? Now that could be read as if you have an empirical investigation, you are somehow involving substances. You can't say much about them, maybe you can't say much beyond the relations, but the very experience points beyond itself, beyond the relation. And that could be connected to the idea of demonstration, of the kind of fruitful, unfruitful, because of what you said about propositional idea of a first principle, right? So in a sense, the difference between a kind of completely speculative, detached demonstration, you know, purely formal, whatever, demonstrations which don't attach to reality, kind of empty models and stuff like that. And the idea he might see Newton as doing is the fact that it starts from an observation which in itself points beyond itself and can serve as a premise, even if you do not have an essence, what you call ontological demonstration, right? So I don't know if that makes any sense too.
No, it absolutely does, and it makes me want to reread the exact passages you were identifying, where Locke says that sensitive knowledge like comes with existence or comes with some guarantor of contact with the outside world. I can report from the Locke universe that the past 10 years have been very contentious with results of sensitive knowledge. So there's been a lot of dispute about the nature, content, structure, classification of sensitive knowledge. Some people think it's not even knowledge. And there's been a lot of scholarly dispute about like how much we get from sensitive knowledge. Lots of you are very young. You don't remember like the bad old days of the 1980s where all of early modern philosophy was just about like the veil of perception and these epistemic like skeptical worries and representation. And but I guess I would say I really like your suggestion, but I want to go back to the texts because there are more and less skeptical readings of sensitive knowledge available, I guess would be one way to put it. And so, but the basic thing you suggest, I really, really like. Like, I want to say that it's not pure mathematical modeling and that there is friction or contact or reaching out or connection to the real world. And that's what guarantees it as knowledge of natural philosophy and not, like Raphael was suggesting this other possibility, not mere mathematics or not mere what Locke would call a castle in the air. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question or comment, which might be the last? If not, please join me in thanking again Patrick for this wonderful session. And it was a great pleasure to discuss with you your text, and we look forward to reading it in the final version and impress.
Me as well. Well, I'll just say thanks so much to everybody for all of your time, for your questions. This has re-energized me about the paper, so I'm actually really looking forward to getting back to it and revising it, and it's been very helpful. And if you're ever in Baltimore, please let me know. I'll owe you a drink or a meal or something.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye. Bye.